every human life images God. Every human life. So as we think about the disabled body, we need to understand and we need to acknowledge that bodily abilities or disabilities in themselves neither advantage nor disadvantage the imaging of God's glory. It's very, very important that we remember this truth. Now, something that I've learned this week is how your worldview can influence and inform you about disability. So, for example, the 20th century modern world sees disability as an abnormal part of life in a normal world. So differences from the norm are seen as something other. It can lead to stigmatizing. The 21st century postmodern world sees disability as a normal part of life in a normal world. So whereas modern thought stigmatizes disability, postmodern thought relativizes disability. And neither of those worldviews fit with the biblical worldview of Christianity. Because biblical Christianity sees disability as something normal in an abnormal world. When our first parents chose to be God instead of bearing his image, the fall of humanity occurred, adversely impacting every aspect of creation. So our world became an abnormal world. And this marring of creation seeped not only into the spiritual, but also the physical and the intellectual and the emotional and the psychological and the social. And that effect carries over in today's work, in our world, and our bodies, and our relationships with self and others and God. And so disability is a manifestation of our broken world. And at the same time, God is at work. God's at work. And more often than we might initially notice, God uses the disabled body. And I want to spend the rest of our time looking at some passages of Scripture that show us how God uses people with weakness, inability, and brokenness to reveal his glory and to teach us to rely on him and not ourselves. So, let's first consider Jacob in Genesis chapter 32. Genesis 32 records an all-night wrestling match between himself and a mysterious stranger, a manifestation of God. All of a sudden, just as Jacob's about to defeat the stranger just takes his index finger and boop, on Jacob's hip, and he's done. Match is over. His hip socket is wrenched violently out of joint, all just with a touch. Jacob says, I will not let you go until you bless me. I'll bless you, but you're going to limp. And Jacob was renamed Israel. Israel, you have contended with God and have overcome. And Jacob, for the rest of his life, limped. His limp was meant to remind him of his spiritual brokenness. No more could he pretend to be strong. Instead, his disability would amplify God's strength in and through him. And is that not true in our lives? That God wrestles with us and touches us. Jacob's limp reminded him and Israel and us that when God touches us, he renames us and he makes us new people. Well, quickly now, let's look at Moses. Moses in Exodus 4. Now, God called Moses to lead Israel out of Egypt. Moses gives 4 excuses. Who am I? Who are you? What if they don't believe me? And then the 4th excuse is, I can't talk so good. How can I speak? Now, scholars will argue whether or not Moses had a disabling speech impairment, but God's response is explicit. Exodus 4, 11 and 12. Then the Lord said to him, who made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. So don't you see? God not only does not deny responsibility for the conditions that we would call disabilities, blindness, deafness, muteness. He assumes responsibility for them. God says these things come from and are made by him. And the Lord's promise to Moses was that he would be with Moses. That's why you're going to get my people out of Egypt. It's not whether or not you have a speech impairment. It's about whether or not I'm with you, and I'm with you. My power will be made perfect in your weakness. So you get out there on the front line. Because what matters is not your ability or your disability. What matters is my presence. Now get out there. Did you hear the word for us, church?